Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to a C-squared recap of the World Championship match between Jan Nepomniachtchi and Ding Liren. This is game 4, and we have a match, ladies and gentlemen. Ding Liren started with the white pieces against Jan with the black pieces. Definitely piled on the pressure in this one. Fabiano, good morning. What do you have for us?
Good morning. Yeah, it was a very exciting game. So let's take it from the beginning. Ding started with the move c4, and this was a departure from his earlier game with the white pieces where he played d4. We've checked that game in detail where he played a very rare idea on the fourth move, which, although it was rare and it even led to an interesting position, I didn't like it too much because it gave Jan too much choice, and I don't think it wasn't the kind of move that puts the maximum pressure on your opponent and makes your opponent scared.
Absolutely.
And
yeah.
He came with very different ideas. So with the first move c4, first of all, we have seen in our pre-match analysis of these two players that they played this English opening in the candidates, right?
Yes.
In the first round of the candidates, which was so crucial for Jan getting a running start and eventually winning the whole tournament. They had the same type of opening, which was c4 and a reverse Sicilian. So he played c4 again, and obviously asking the question, do you want to go for reverse Sicilian lines again, or do you want to play, as for example, Jan in the past, and I remember in the 2020 candidates, going for some kind of symmetrical English, let's call it c4, c5.
Yes.
And for example, there was a very famous game against Giri. Again, Jan won that game. Although in that case, Giri came with some absolutely astonishing preparation, some really, really impressive stuff, which is still relevant to this day. But Jan somehow managed to win that game as well in very impressive fashion. So
and Jan starts with knight to f6, not c5, not e5 immediately, but rather knight to f6. Can you detail the idea behind this particular move order? Waiting one more move to play the move e5 after knight to c3, which happened in the game.
Yeah, when your opponent plays knight to f6, of course, it can mean many things. For example, it could mean after knight c3 they want to play e6, which is an invitation either to transposition to other stuff like the Nimzo, d4, bishop b4, or it's basically an invitation to play third move e4, right?
Yes, the floor.
And then d5, and this is a huge amount of theory and a very topical and very large theoretical battlefield in modern chess. And also considered quite decent for black. Black is considered to equalize here from an objective point of view, although it's not the most, let's say, the most popular. Usually when people play knight f6, they want to play the reverse Sicilian, but if they play c45 on the first move, then white has the option of playing second move g3. And if black plays knight f6 here, white does not have to commit to developing the knight to c3. White can play bishop to g2. And we actually did discuss this a little bit in our pre-match analysis because, for example, we analyzed a game Ding against Jan from 2019 Zagreb Grand Chess Tour, and it went cd5, knight d5. And here again, white avoids developing the knight to c3 and instead plays knight to f3.
Delays knight c3 and then goes for an early d4, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, knight c6 castle. One point is that if bishop e7 after castle, there's the move d4, which is something that you wouldn't have if you had played knight c3.
Yeah.
The other thing is that if black wants to go for some kind of bishop c5 lines, for example, knight c6 castle, bishop c5, it's such a decent choice in the, let's say if white had the knight on c3 earlier. But here, bishop c5 allows knight takes c5. Knight takes c5 and d4. And again, because there's no knight on c3 to capture, white had an extra tempo basically in setting up this tactic. And this works out quite well for white.
Yes. Very nice.
So there's some other points. For example, black cannot play bishop to b4 at any moment because the knight on c3 kind of invites bishop to b4, right? Some sort of reverse Rossolimo stuff.
Yes.
Without the knight on c3 there, well, there's simply an empty move hitting nothing. And so black usually in these positions ends up playing maybe some kind of c6 on the third move is very topical, or on the second move as well, but that's basically its own set of theory, right?
Yes.
So white is trying, white would gain more flexibility if c4, e5, and knight f6 is saying, basically, if you want to play knight c3 to keep the game into pure English territory, then I will limit your options somewhat. If instead of knight c3 you play, for example, knight to f3, which completely avoids the reverse Sicilian,
Yes.
then I'm happy to play e6. And
Mm,
now if you play knight c3, you didn't have this kind of e4 stuff that we briefly mentioned, right?
because
Now
you're in
after knight
time to play d5.
d5, yeah, now the pawn can't go to e4. Knight c3, d5. The commitment of white's knight to f3 changes things.
Makes
And
sense.
here, if white plays d4, then we're no longer in English territory. We have transposed into the queen's gambit decline. So if white plays knight to f3 on second move, usually it's connected with a fianchetto of the bishop, g3, bishop g2, and some sort of, well, this is, again, its own huge branch of theory, which we don't have to get into, but it's not considered super dangerous for black theoretically. So knight f6 is a flexible move. It's asking white, do you want to commit your knight to f3,
Or to
which has
c3.
its own downsides, or do you want to commit your knight to c3, which has its own downsides? Black stays flexible because black's knight almost always wants to stay on f6.
Very cool, very cool. All right, so he played knight c3, e5, knight to f3 now, inviting this new idea, novel path that they've been exploring with the move e4 recently. I would say probably e4 is a bit too sharp for a world championship match. He decides to play the much more classical knight to c6, e3.
Yeah, e4 is an interesting move. It's basically because usually, and for all of chess history pretty much, has been considered that after knight g5, you are actually just losing your pawn. For
Correct.
example, queen e7, queen c2, right?
Yes.
And then, because of computers, I mean, people didn't come up with this themselves. They found that after knight g5, you have this move c6, which looks completely ridiculous because it just gives up the pawn on e4. But after you take the pawn, then black plays d5, and because black gains so much time on this knight, which if it goes to g3, then gets hit with h5, black somehow gets enough compensation. And this was played by Levon, by Pragnananta, by other strong players and creative players like Jordan van Forest, Niels Grandelius, and so on and so forth. So that's its own theory, and somehow it objectively doesn't seem bad for black, although it is super, super risky. And yeah, you probably have easier and safer ways to play the opening with black. So
Especially in a
Jan
world
plays
championship match.
knight to c6. Yeah, especially in a match. Although in a match, yeah, I mean, maybe some people would be inspired to play some kind of wild stuff. But
we might see
Jan
that
plays,
if Jan is in need for a victory with the black pieces. That might be an option later on in the match.
yeah, well, we can't predict, but anything's possible. Anything's possible.
Knight c6.
So knight
e3.
c6. E3, okay, this is a very interesting moment because white has a huge choice, and from what I have known about Ding, G3 is his the move that he's usually gravitated towards. And I've also played this a ton, and basically every top player has played this ton. But Ding has himself. Levon is a huge expert. I've played this myself countless times, and basically if you throw a rock at a strong chess player, they have probably played this position after G3.
Yeah.
So G3 is, I would guess, my guess would be, although it's not 100%,
D5.
that after G3, probably bishop to B4 is what Jan would have prepared. Although, for example, Hikaru recently against me in our Chessable Masters match, he played knight to D4, right? Also fine move.
Yes.
I mean, it's possible that Jan prepared knight D4. It's also possible, actually, now that I think about it, no. Although bishop b4 is a good move, probably Jan would have prepared d5, cd5, knight d5, bishop g2, and bishop c5.
That's what you
For some reason,
match. Yeah.
It slipped my mind that of course this is like the main line these days. Is bishop c5.
Did people actually find a cure for this bishop c5? As
No.
far as I know, nothing has been found. Right? Nothing.
So like
major,
the
at
recent
least.
trend in some games has been like, I think Ferrugia has been messing around with castle and some kind of queen c2. Was it Ferrugia or maybe it was like Magnus?
Yeah.
But some strong players have been messing around with this queen c2. Because after queen c2, black should kind of know. Otherwise, white gets an interesting position. Black should know that there's like this knight to d4. And if knight takes d4, the point is knight to b4. So I think basically when people play this, they're kind of counting. For example, I see, Magnus played it against Le Quang Liam. People are counting basically in rapid games that their opponent doesn't remember knight d4, knight d4, knight b4.
Got it.
So that's the extent basically of white's opening tries in this line now. It's hope. I mean, it's not even based on like some sort of concrete idea. It's just I hope my opponent doesn't know it.
Got it. All right, so he decided to shy away from that. He played the move 4, e3. Once again, on move 4, we see Ding essay some sort of not necessarily a novelty in itself, but novel approach for himself. He was more attracted to this g3 stuff. Now he decides to surprise Jan briefly with this move e3.
Well, okay, he has played it. I actually consider myself like sort of, because I was playing at this line with e3 so much at some point, I consider myself like sort of a bit of a, or at least I used to consider myself sort of a bit of a specialist of this line. So e3 is of course a main move. It has, you know, God knows how many games, maybe over 10,000 with this move, including by the top players in the world like Magnus and so on. And I played it against Ding myself in the last round, China-USA of the 2018 Olympiad. Last round, when we were both leading, so it was a very important match.
Yeah.
And I ended up drawing the game. The match ended up being drawn, and China took the Olympiad on tie breaks over the USA. So e3, what's the point? First of all, if Black wants to play d5, going for typical Sicilian positions, White takes, and bishop to b5. And it's very annoying to deal with this pin. And in fact, the only reasonable way to do so is that you take on c3, bc3, bishop d6. But of course, taking on c3 is a very double-edged sword because it gives White extremely good central control, and White can play d4. And I've played this against Shakhriyar Mamdiyar with the black pieces. And I've also played this, I think, with the white pieces at some point, but I remember that game against Shakhriyar because it was Norway chess, it was a classical game, and I was under pressure. So this is not where people usually go with black because it's considered that White has a bit of a more pleasant position. Bishop b4 is what Jan played. This is the main line.
Yes.
Considered the best line. And basically the point is if White tries to play knight d5, trying to disturb the bishop on b4, then he gets hit with e4, and the knight really doesn't have, knight on f3 has nowhere comfortable to run to. If it goes to g1, obviously White is wasting a lot of time. If it goes to g5, it basically ends up in a very bad state after knight takes d5, followed by queen g5.
Yes.
So that's why queen c2 is the main move after bishop to b4.
Which he played, queen to c2.
Which is what Ding played.
A very interesting moment, and you know, whenever you start playing chess, your coaches are definitely telling you to wait for the bishop on b4 or much more commonly on b5 in the Ruy Lopez to be attacked with a6 if you do want to take on c6. You're kind of losing a tempo if you take it directly. In this case, he just takes it. Bishop takes c3.
Yeah, this is the main line. This is considered an extremely good way for Black to play, and has actually been, I think, closely related to the, let's say, death. I mean, I wouldn't use such a strong word, but let's dramatize it a bit. The death of the fourth move, e3. At least, at some point, you know, it was clear that Black can play this bishop takes c3, and then people were testing Black in all sorts of ways in this bishop takes c3, and then eventually everyone was like, okay, you guys won. Bishop c3 is good. We admit it.
So we stop playing for e3, yeah?
Yeah, and people don't really play e3 on the fourth move as much because of this reason, which is also the first line on the computer.
Yeah.
That being said, bishop c3 is not, I mean, you can also castle. The reason why people don't like to castle so much is because now the knight comes to d5. And the point of queen c2 is now you cannot play e4 because knight f6, queen e4 wins a pawn. So that's why queen c2 happened. And now after knight d5, a lot of people have played rook e8. It's the main line of the castle move. It's still a hugely theoretical position. And I remember a long time ago, there was this game, back when theory was not as well developed, a game Grishuk-Giri from 2013 Grand Prix, and it was a city near Paris. And so basically after rook e8, queen f5 happened. Funny looking move. Usually you say don't develop the queen in the opening, but here the point is, of course, White either wants to provoke Black to take on d5 or to take on f6, and that's what happened. d6, knight f6, queen f6. Queen f6 probably not the best move.
Yes.
But this is what Giri played, queen f6, gf6, and eventually Grishuk won this game against Giri. And the reason I remember was because I was playing in that tournament and because it was also a brilliant game from Grishuk. And so people don't castle so much anymore, although instead of queen takes f6 on move 8, gf6 is actually a fine position for black. It's just super, super sharp, and people prefer a simpler life with black. They prefer not to go for some kind of crazy positions after gf6, queen h5, e4, and a3, or e4, rook g1, and some sort of complete mess.
Some wild stuff.
Ensues.
Yeah.
Yeah, completely wild stuff.
Because you might get checkmated.
And so that's why they take on c3.
Yeah.
Bishop c3, what Jan played, it's actually to be expected. Like, if black is going for the reverse Sicilian, I think 85, 90% of the time I can expect that I can get this with white if I want.
Yeah.
The problem is usually I don't want to because it's considered so good for black.
Yeah. B takes c3, d6, e4. Again, moving twice with the same pawn in the open. It's something that the coaches definitely don't recommend early on in one's
I just
career.
want to, like, this b takes c3 moment, just want to ponder on it for a second.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely.
Because white has two ways to capture, and queen c3 has always been the main way. And after queen c3, black plays queen e7, and then follows up almost always with some kind of d5 and e4 pushes. And the reason why this is good for black is because the queen on c3 gets kicked around a lot. Because, of course, from a positional strategic point of view, white has the two bishops, and in the Sicilian position, you would think, like, if white got time to fully develop, white would be doing very well with the two bishops in this type of position. But usually white is not considered to have time to fully consolidate before black gets d5. If white takes, then knight takes d5, gains a tempo on the queen, and so on. e4, it's knight on f3. So that's basically why this bishop takes c3 exists, because of this sort of...
It's this long-term advantage of the two bishop versus the dynamic play that black gets, hitting up the queen, hitting up the knight on f3, basically just getting a lot of speed in the game. That generally gives black enough compensation for the two bishops.
Yeah, it's a battle of short versus long-term factors. So with b takes c3, it changes the whole situation entirely, because with the queen on c2, it can't really be attacked. And black is no longer in the mood to play d5 because that would undouble white's c-pawns. So white is now taking a long-term disadvantage, ruining the pawn structure to a degree, right, with the doubled c-pawns, but avoiding all of those short-term problems that we see after queen takes c3. So now it becomes a pure strategic fight. Two bishops, doubled c-pawns. And the doubled c-pawns can be, in some ways, they are a slight asset in terms of giving some central control, allowing, for example, d4 with a lot of central control. But they are a very long-term disadvantage because if white plays d4 at any moment, the c4 pawn becomes a weakness. It can no longer be defended by a brother, let's say, on b3 or on d3. So the c-pawns, we do have to say, it's not best to have them, but they do have some strategic potential in terms of allowing an expansion with d4 and e4 and so on.
As well as, the b file being open and potentially hinder, let's say, black's light square bishop on c8's movement with the move rook to b1 and tying it up to the defense of the pawn on b7. That can easily be cured with moves such as b6, and then potentially just the bishop comes out to a6. And once again, we understand why black's main plan is to target, or at least put some pressure on these two pawns, two weak c-pawns that you just mentioned.
Yeah, there's all the moves that you mentioned are very typical. Rook to b1, it very typically happens in these positions, and then usually black will answer with b6. It's just sometimes these moves just get included, as in it doesn't change the position much, but we'll just throw those moves in. Because they're easy moves for each player to make.
Okay, he played d6.
d6. Also, e4 is an interesting move, but it's like a big theoretical battle there as well, and we don't have to get involved in the theory there because it's quite topical. It's quite complex as well, and it's not necessary. So d6. I mean, d6 is a perfectly fine move. e4 is an interesting one, but not necessary by any means.
Castle, bishop e2.
So d6, e4. The reason why white plays e4 is because white is not ready to play d4 and allowing some kind of e4 stuff potentially and closing off the bishop on c1. That bishop could become a very poor piece. With e4, white is saying, I want my bishop to be alive. I will play e4, and then maybe I'll play d3, maybe I'll play d4, but I don't want my bishop dead on c1.
Makes
Another way
sense.
we could see the bishop dead on c1 is a very interesting one. If white plays d3, on move 7.
Mm-hmm.
Black actually has this very interesting move, which people haven't played before, but it's a very interesting one. And it's a pawn sacrifice, e4. D takes e4.
You're giving out novelties around here. All right.
Okay, the computer shows it instantly. I mean, also d3 on move 7 is a kind of silly move in general, but specifically, I just wanted to point out this e4, which is it is a novelty, but I'm not giving out big secrets here. D takes e4, and then queen 7. And you know what this reminds me of? It reminds me very much of these positions from the Sicilian, from like the normal Sicilian, e4, c5.
The Rosolimo.
The Rosolimo.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember there was some game like from the reverse side of it, some game Geary was white against Magnus Carlsen. And basically he came up with this positional pawn sacrifice. Of course, in that case, he was with the white pieces. But exactly same structure, exactly same ideas. White can defend the pawn on e4 with like knight d2 followed by f3. But then you defend your pawn, but you're left with a bishop on c1 that is in complete passivity. And your extra pawn, it doesn't actually make an impact on the position in any way. Because you can play knight d2, you can play f3, and you're completely solidifying your pawn advantage.
You're going to be a pawn up, yes.
You're going to be a pawn up, but you're going to be left with that dead bishop, and your pawn's completely immobile. The c pawn's not doing much. In fact, you'd probably prefer to not have your c3 pawn, so that you could play bishop b2 and get like a very nice long diagonal. Cool. So this stuff is actually not good for white. This all explains why Ding played e4, moving a pawn for the second time, but avoiding all of those ideas and ensuring that the bishop on c1 will have a future.
Excellent. Castle.
e4, castle, bishop to e2. Why bishop e2? Ding does not want to commit his d pawn yet. He doesn't know if he wants to play d3 or d4. That's why he stays flexible, playing bishop to e2.
Knight h5, and now we see the move d4.
Yeah, knight h5. Also, this is maybe not the best move. I mean, I myself played this recently in Rapid against Tabatabai, and I played with some kind of knight e7 plan. First, I played h6, castle knight e7. I put my knight on g6 because the knight is very influential there. And I don't know if this is the best plan for black, but computer says it's playable. Computer says other things are also playable. You can basically approach this in many ways, including playing, for example, h6, and then following up with some kind of knight h7 ideas, and then f5. Basically, the world is your oyster. Black has an abundance of ideas here. Mm-hmm. But knight to h5, it feels like it's not maybe the most accurate way for black. So Ding played d4. The funny thing is this was actually played, and I think people have like pointed this out after what Jan played, which was maybe a bit of a questionable decision to play knight to f4. It was played in a game of Richard Rapport from a million years ago, so I don't even know if...
more than a decade ago, yes.
If anyone had, if either of the players had known that over the board.
They have not.
But
they told me that, well, not told me. They did mention it during the press conference. They asked Ding whether this was some sort of a preparation of his second report. And I think after knight to f4, he said that, yeah, that was just a novel territory for Ding. He was on his own after this move, knight to f4.
Yeah, computer doesn't like it, and that's why probably it wasn't analyzed so much by Ding. Maybe queen to f6 was analyzed by him, or f5. These are very critical moves.
Yes.
f5, for example, is a move that I would analyze. It's like the first move I would analyze. I don't know if it's good or not, but I just play f5 because it's obviously very direct, so it's the first move that might come to mind.
And it combines very well with your last move, knight to h5.
Yeah, knight h5, f5, and you try to open the f-file. Very typical stuff, right? And then white castles. White actually doesn't take on f5. Mm-hmm. And it's a complicated position. I don't know if white is any better, but certainly white has gotten a fight. So that's a good thing.
Yeah.
And some potential, certainly, to outplay black in these positions.
He played the move
the same with queen f6.
Yeah.
Queen f6 on move 9 is a very committal decision because you leave your knight on h5 and you allow all sorts of g3 ideas, cutting out the knight of the game entirely. Either immediately or first d5, the knight goes back, black's knight goes back maybe to b8 and then g3. And then this knight on h5 is, it's looking a bit sad.
You have to take it back
f6
very quickly with queen e7, knight f6 probably.
Yeah, but then white has gained a lot of time.
Yeah.
So anyway, Jan plays knight f4, but the computer is not approving of this move. But it's not such a bad move, I think.
Mhm.
Anyway, white takes. That's kind of you have to take.
Good
Takes.
reaction. Yes. Take.
Castle is the best move and most natural move. Although we have to say Richie, in his typical style, played h4, a move which doesn't really. I mean, it kind of comes to mind, but I don't really know why you would play. I mean, you want to try to play some knight g5, but you don't really believe knight g5 will ever work out.
That's
So it's
typical
a funny
Richie.
move.
Typical
Yeah,
Richie style.
typical Richie going for some very creative stuff. Instead, Ding castled, which is probably objectively the better move.
Mhm.
Queen to f6, natural move. The queen kind of feels safe and at home on f6, and it defends the f4 pawn. Rook f to e1, natural move, developing the rook to an open file, and maybe the bishop will go to d3, or maybe it'll go to f1. We don't know yet, but the rook definitely feels very nice on e1.
Yes.
Rook to e8, likewise, rook feels at home on e8. Here was definitely a pivotal moment for the game because white had a lot of choice here. It's not a very concrete position. And Ding chose a move which definitely comes to mind immediately, bishop to d3. But it might not be the best decision, but I also don't think it's a bad decision, and it certainly didn't negatively affect the game for him. He still had a very good fight afterwards.
Yeah.
So white had a lot of interesting options. For example, there's an interesting pawn sacrifice for the initiative, c5.
Ooh.
D takes c5, otherwise white has solved the issue of the double pawns, right?
Mm-hmm.
And now white has cleared the path for e5. And we see similar things like this in the game, but at this moment it was definitely very interesting because white's central pawns are super, super powerful. And I don't know if white is much better here, but certainly white has an initiative which is very unpleasant to face.
Just to kind of try to explain it, maybe why Ding didn't go for this early on, because he clearly had this plan in mind, as we will see later on in the game. But perhaps he was just reluctant to allow these C and D pawns to maybe be exchanged. For example, queen to h6 with the e file still clogged by the bishop on e2. You don't have the move d5, right? d5, knight takes c5, and you lose the pawn. With the bishop on d3, you have ideas of later on in this type of position with the bishop on d3 to play d5 with the e5 pawn defended. That pushes black's pieces even more so towards the back.
Yeah, I think that he would be a bit reluctant at this moment taking such a responsible decision. And also, it doesn't immediately come to mind that white has compensation that might be enough for an advantage, which is actually how it is, that white might actually be pressing for advantage here, although it remains like super, super difficult to say. But it just feels like first you take some more natural moves, and then you make the kind of decision like c5, which is a game-altering decision because this really changes the nature of the game. First, you make some preparatory moves, and then you strike or do something like that later in the game. He did have a very interesting preparatory move, rook a to d1, which is definitely preparing some kind of c5 stuff, but first putting the rook in the center. But for sure, he was worried about some kind of queen to g6 stuff. And queen to g6, it's attacking e4. And the problem is if white plays bishop to e3 now, then bishop to h3 is super annoying. So maybe he saw this kind of queen g6 stuff and he was worried. But white has an absolutely remarkable idea after queen to g6. Purely computer thing. I would never a human wouldn't even see the first move. And even if a human somehow saw the first move after queen g6, I don't think a human would ever see the follow-up. So the first move is queen to c1. And it's attacking f4, but it's also leaving e4 hanging. And although you can't take on e4 with the queen, and this is very obvious, that because the bishop moves anywhere, and basically you lose your queen or your rook on e8. That part is obvious, but black can play rook takes e4, and rook takes e4, you might immediately think bishop to d3, I'm winning the game. But then you see this move bishop to h3, and you realize, oh no, I'm actually not winning the game at all, because with bishop h3, black is not only threatening checkmate on g2, but also defending the 8th rank, which means that after knight to h4, rook takes e1, rook takes e1, queen takes d3, there is no longer a rook to e8 checkmate because the rook was cleared. The path of the rook was cleared. After rook to e4, all of this stuff could be maybe calculated. It's very difficult to figure this all out, but for an excellent player, for a very strong player, you can maybe figure this out with some calculation. But after rook takes e4, the computer suddenly says another move. Queen to b1.
And so some sort of a triangulation of the queen, yeah? Queen c2, queen
some
c1, queen
very
b1.
bizarre stuff. queen c1 followed by queen to b1. And now the threat is bishop to d3. And the point is the queen on b1 would protect the bishop on d3, so it would make all of these variations with bishop to h3 not work for black, because the bishop on d3 would not be captured.
That's crazy.
And then after queen to b1, black has to play rook to e7. And now white plays bishop to d3. And even after finding all this, it still is not like super clear. But white will get the h7 pawn, and this is definitely a very interesting position for white. But I mean, nobody finds queen c1, queen b1. This is just, I'm just mentioning it because the computer mentions it as an idea.
Alien chess.
But yeah, you never play this. Okay, the move that Ding chose is very, very natural, bishop to d3. And Jan played a pretty much, to my eye, natural and maybe even like an automatic move, bishop to g4. If white gets time to play h3, then black's bishop will have nowhere really to go to. So black is very, very happy to get this bishop to an influential square before that happens. And that being said, white could have also played h3, the previous move. And the reason I think that Ding wouldn't want to go for this was because of queen to g6. And he probably didn't feel comfortable with king on h2, because then maybe black gets some kind of queen h6 followed by g5 ideas, which that's just to say that on the previous move, white had so many options, and all of them are kind of unclear, and all of them look playable. That's why I would never criticize the move bishop to d3, because
if you did watch our pre-match recap, you can understand that Ding maybe has some PTSD about these ideas of g5, g4, and opening the h file.
Well, yeah, maybe he drew some parallel there, but I don't know. Like, the computer kind of doesn't like bishop d3, but to my eye, it's like the position is too complicated to say that one move is clearly better than the other, especially from a practical point of view. So bishop g4. So obviously white does not want to allow some kind of bishop takes f3 and the doubling of the f pawn, so white played knight to d2. Here Jan made a very questionable move, but also a move I find difficult to criticize. He played knight to a5. The knight is kind of vulnerable on a5. He should have played rook a to d8, and then after h3, yeah, he moves his bishop back. I don't know if c8 or d7. White would probably play knight to f3, and then black would maybe try to get some g5 stuff. And although black played bishop g4 c8, black is happy to have gotten the rook outside of the bishop, let's say. Black got the rook to a very nice square. So on a8, it would be out of the game. On d8, it doesn't look like it's doing much, but the rooks are connected. And this will definitely play its part in case white plays e5 at some moment, for example. Certainly the rook would be very happy to be on d8 in that case. So this is an unclear position.
Yes.
A to d8, I think that Jan, you know, even though maybe he didn't play the most accurate knight h5, f4 stuff, he still got a decent position from the opening.
Yeah.
Knight to a5 was really the start of his issues, and those issues persisted for a long time to come.
Yeah.
Ding made a very interesting move, c5. I think that maybe the best move is queen to a4, and the point of queen a4 is after b6. First I play f3. Black's bishop goes back, let's say, to e6. And then I play knight to b3. And this was maybe highlighting one of the downsides of knight to a5, because black should probably take on b3. And now white takes with the a pawn. And now white's structure is completely fixed. And this is a beautiful structure. Instead of the c pawns being, as we said, without, you know, any of their friends nearby, that b pawn lends a lot of support. It also allows the a file to be open for white's rook.
That's such a nice block of pawns, right? It's just like
we like to talk about the compactness of the pawn structure, and here white's pawn structure is very compact. And because black's e pawn shifted to f4, black does not have as much central control, and so white definitely has a very unpleasant advantage here. And it's a very long-term advantage, which basically black will have to defend against for a long time. So this was a nice chance for Ding, but the move he played I also like, c5. We mentioned this pawn sacrifice. Black kind of wants to play dc5 because otherwise white fixed the pawns, right?
And now follow with e5.
e5 as he played, gaining a tempo on the queen, queen h6, and now d5. And this is a very nice central pawn formation. For me, I would definitely not be sure to go for this with white. I might actually be attracted more to that queen a4 move, because here white's pawns are super powerful, but they also could be vulnerable. And if one of those pawns falls or gets traded off with either c6 or f6, then white may no longer have the necessary compensation, at least for an advantage. So this was a responsible decision, but definitely one which was interesting. And it turns out that white does have very strong pressure here. So it was maybe not the best decision, but certainly not one we can fault.
From a practical perspective, intriguing at the same time being a point down in the match. Definitely an appealing decision by Ding Liren.
Well, a point and a pawn down. So
That is true.
he is a pawn down and he is a point down, but he does have an interesting position.
Very good.
So rook 8 to d8. Natural. The rook kind of just wants to go on d8. Sometimes we see like a chain of moves, like black played rook d8, white played c4. A chain of moves which you just get out of the way. Of course, both sides, like black can play another move, but besides rook d8. But at some point, those moves, rook d8 and c4, will happen in this game.
Yeah.
So they just got it out of the way at the start.
Yeah.
The same with the move b6. At some point, black will want to give some support to the knight on a5, and the pawn on c5, so black plays b6.
Mm-hmm.
h3, bishop h5, normal. Again, white, kicks the bishop back. On the other hand, the bishop is going to g6, and white's bishop is better than black, so black is not opposed to this trade of bishops.
Mm-hmm.
Here, bishop to e4, I think queen c3 was also, like queen c3 was maybe a bit more accurate, because after bishop to g6, white could maybe consider some kind of bishop to e2 and some kind of maneuvering play.
Mm-hmm.
But bishop to e4 is a fine move. The tactical point is you might see the rook, the pawn d5 is hanging. Rook takes e5, fails, so bishop takes h7.
Yes.
That's kind of a little tactic. And that idea will persist in case, let's say, queen to g5, white plays queen to c3. Actually, white can also take on h7, but computer prefers queen to c3 for some reason. And again, if black takes on e5, this bishop takes h7 tactics.
Exactly.
So, rook to e7. Maybe this was a sign that Jan shouldn't have played rook 8 to d8, that Jan should have instead played rook to e7 on move 17.
And then get the other rook to e8 in one move.
Yeah, but this is not a very, it's a position where you expect that both sides will waste the tempo at some point because it's kind of a maneuvering position.
Yeah.
It looks super open, but white's pawns on e5 and d5 are somehow very stable. And white also can't break through because there's no significant weaknesses in black's position. So it's kind of a maneuvering battle for now. Rook to e7, queen to c3, rook d to e8, bishop to f3. Excellent move. At some point, the pressure on e5 was becoming strong, and white really needs a knight on f3 to defend that pawn at some point. Not immediately, but white doesn't want to play knight to f3 immediately because then the knight is always in danger of getting chopped off. Not immediately, but knight to f3, shockingly, is kind of a losing move because black plays g6.
G6, queen g7, yeah, and then the e5 pawn just pretty much falls.
Yeah, not obvious to me, but once you play the move g6, it kind of becomes clear that things are going wrong for white because queen g7 followed by bishop takes f3, and that e-pawn is maybe not long for this world. So Ding makes a good move, bishop to f3. And actually, it was funny, if black avoids the bishop trade with bishop g6, I think maybe Ding wanted this bishop to d1 idea, and the bishop comes to a4.
Yeah.
And that's disturbing the rook on e8, so it's very annoying for black.
Yeah.
So instead, Jan plays the best move, the knight to b7. And I think he already had the idea in mind for what he was going to do, which is what we see in a few moves, which is at some point he wants to play f6.
Yes.
And f6 is very double-edged. On the one hand, it allows white's pawn to go to e6, and that is a very powerful passed pawn, which completely cuts off black's play and keeps the rooks on e7 and e8 completely passive for the moment.
Yeah.
On the other hand, that allows a knight to go to d6, and that knight on d6,
which happened in the game.
Yeah, we see this, for example, knight b7, rook e2. So white is also logically trying to double rooks, although it actually turned out that it was much better to take on h5 first, queen h5 and knight f3. And because in the game, black had the option to keep the bishops on the board, and that was actually a dangerous option, or not dangerous, but a very interesting option for black. And so white should have probably just nipped that in the bud right away and taken on h5. And after rook to e2, now plays the move f6, and I really like this move. It's forcing e6 because white can't take on f6 due to the rook on e2 would be hanging, and white can't allow fe5 or anything like that, or rook e5. So white has to play e6. And here Jan played knight e6, and I think maybe the right decision was to play bishop to g6. Because when I see the position, if black plays bishop g6 and puts a knight on d6, one of the ideas of keeping the bishops on is that if white ever tries to disturb that knight on d6, which is such a powerful piece with knight e4, black will very happily not trade the knight, but the bishop on e4. And the knight on d6 remains as a powerful outpost. It's defensive, but it also attacks c4. So it remains both a defensive and an attacking piece. And it basically, even though white has that super pawn on e6, the knight on d6 allows black to have a decent position. And here it's very difficult for white, I think, to prove an advantage.
Yes.
If white continues to try to trade the bishops, for example, bishop to e4, then, well, first of all, black can play bishop to h5 with some sort of repetition. But also there's knight to d6, and you're trading on g6 on black's terms. Bishop g6 allows hg6, and we see the kind of compactness of the structure. The pawn going from h7 to g6 actually does help black because it allows g5 and g4, and black doesn't have to spoil his kingside by going for this g5 stuff.
Yeah.
And Jan played knight d6, and again, I think this is a moment Ding should have taken on h5. But instead he played rook a to e1, and I think this was a moment, this is where Jan started to drift very, very heavily.
Yes.
Bishop g6, excellent move. And I don't think white is better here.
Now, I want to ask you about, you did praise this idea of knight to b7, f6, and knight to d6, but from a practical point of view, and I understand the objective specter of this whole plan, but from a practical point of view, allowing this pawn chain with a spear on e6, isn't that like extremely unpleasant, dangerous in a world championship match with so much pressure and so much tendency to just simply go wrong and make mistakes? Small mistakes, but that can lead, with the inclusion of this pawn on e6, to devastating consequences.
Well, I don't think that we should say like world championship match, because when these guys are at the board, of course, you know, in between games and everything, the whole that this is a world championship match is weighing on their minds. But once they're actually in the position, they're only thinking, okay, the position. They're not thinking it's a world championship match, I can't make these moves. Or at least they shouldn't be thinking that, because that's a very dangerous way to negatively affect your play. If you're starting to think it's a world championship match, I don't want to, you know, allow a pawn on e6. You should only be calculating and assessing the position from a positional, from a point of view of the game, not the tournament context. Of course, it matters for the players. It doesn't matter at all for the position. Chess doesn't care what tournament you're playing. So the other thing is, I actually don't think it's an impractical decision, because before black played f6, black always had to deal with the possibility, is white going to play d6? I always have to calculate d6. Is white going to play e6? I always have to calculate e6. After that, after the pawn structure becomes fixed, white has no pawn breaks, which means that white has to try to break through in a different way. And the only way that I can see white breaking through is you need to trade off the knight from d6. That knight keeps the whole thing together. You need to trade that knight off, so at some point you can play d6 and open up the position and count on that e-pawn. But that e-pawn alone, it's not going to win you the game. You need to get rid of the knight on d6 so that you can open up the position. And then, if we imagine the knights on d2 and d6 become taken off the board, then white plays some kind of d6, cd6, bishop c6, or targets the pawn on d6. And then suddenly the pawn on e6, it's not just a passed pawn, it's a very powerfully supported passed pawn, which is going to, and then we try to get rid of the rook on e7 and we try to push that pawn further.
Yeah.
With that knight on d6, without getting rid of it, I see no way for white to really meaningfully make progress here. And when we talk about practical, we're talking about if you know what you're doing in a position, then it's a practical position for you, because you know what you want. After bishop to g6, I think black knows what he wants, which is either just kind of waiting, or maybe I'll play some kind of bishop f5, g5, and so on, and try to create some sort of kingside play. Because black does have more kingside pawns, let's say from f file to h file. So what black has some, let's say, some justification for playing on the king side. What's white's plan? Besides trading off the knight from d6, I do not see any meaningful plan, which means that from a practical point of view, it's very difficult for white to play this position. And if Jan had played the move bishop g6, I can only speculate. Obviously, we don't know the future. I don't think he would have lost this game. So bishop g6, I think, was a very important moment. And instead, he played the move knight to f5. After knight f5, Ding played a series of excellent moves. Bishop h5, queen h5, and rook to e4. Rook d4 is a multi-purpose move, as we'll see. First of all, it's attacking the pawn on f4. And the second thing is that the rook on e4 is asking black, okay, if you ever put your knight on d4, maybe I'll sacrifice in exchange. I don't know yet, but maybe. So rook to e4, queen to h6, queen to f3. And this was a very big moment in the game. The f4 pawn is attacked. Black has basically, obviously if black loses the pawn, then his position just sucks because, white has all the positional advantages. So black has two moves which come to mind immediately. One move is knight to d4, right? And the point of knight d4 is if white takes on f4, rook f4, black has this move c6, and your pawns, they look super strong, but if you can't play d6, then black will play cd5, followed by rook d8, and these pawns end up becoming extremely vulnerable, it turns out. The other move which comes to mind after queen f3 is the move g5. Just, I'm defending my pawn. And this was the correct move. I think what Ding wanted here was an excellent move, g4. This is like kind of the idea of queen f3. It's a typical idea. It's basically, you can't take en passant. fg3, queen f5 wins a piece. And so you have to make a decision with that knight. If it goes to d4, I will sacrifice the exchange on d4. If it goes to h4, you're no longer blockading the pawn. And that knight on h4, it looks kind of threatening, but it doesn't end up doing very much. Queen to d3, and white will at some point try to push forward d6. So you would think, and in fact it's the best move, is knight to d6. Again, that knight is super strong. But then white plays rook 4 to e2, and the plan for white is to remove that knight from d6. You can't do it immediately because c4 is hanging, but you can play queen to d3 followed by knight to e4. Once you get rid of that knight, it will be a very dangerous major piece endgame for black, because at some point white will try to push forward d6, and the e6 pawn, with minor pieces, black is controlling it well. With only rooks on the board, I don't think black is controlling it well enough.
Yeah.
This is a complicated position. For sure, white is the one who has better chances. I would take white 100 out of 100 times.
Of course. Yeah.
But from an objective point of view, probably black is defending this. But you have to continue playing very well. And I think practically, I try to speak about the practical position because from a computer point of view, Ding's last few moves weren't the best.
Yeah.
But practically, we're talking about a difference between, let's say, 0.5 and 0.1. These are computer evaluations. From a human point of view, the only question is, can white remove the knight from d6? Can black create some kind of kingside counterplay with f5? We're not thinking in terms of numbers. We're thinking in terms of moves and ideas.
Yeah.
So this would have remained very tough for Jan, but much, much better than what he did, which was after queen f3, he made the second move which comes to mind, knight to d4. And I don't know what he was thinking. I'm sure that he saw knight d4, queen f4, rook f4, c6, and he was happy about that. But why he allowed rook takes d4, I don't know. Maybe he can explain it himself. Personally, I can't explain it because...
He said it in the press conference. He said that he misassessed the position after rook takes d4, which is, the way he described it was a small lack of focus in that particular moment. He just lost focus with this move knight to d4. So that's a very dangerous thing to do, especially with so much riding on one particular move in this type of very, very tense position. I mean, you have a pawn on e6. There's no other way to describe this position as extremely tense.
Basically, from a positional point of view, and I trust his explanation for this. It seems like he lost concentration and his judgment slipped for a second.
Yeah.
From a positional point of view, it's super obvious. Like if you ask Jan who's better here after knight b3, he's like, okay, white's better. He gives it like 30 more seconds thought. Okay, white's winning. The knight is coming to d4. It's coming to f5, c6, and black's rooks. Okay, you can say black is up in exchange, and a pawn, but the pawn is temporary.
Yeah.
Black is up in exchange. Those rooks on e7 and e8, they're going to be targeted by the knight, and you will be lucky if you just lose a rook for a knight, because the knight on c6, it's worth more than a rook.
Yeah.
So I sometimes I remember reading about this term in one of Jonathan Rowson's books, It was tension transference. It was like, why do we make mistakes? And sometimes the tension becomes unbearable that you just want to make a decision. And if he had made the decision G5, that keeps the tension in the position. And tension, especially when it builds up over the course of a stressful tournament or a match, it becomes more and more that you just want to release it.
Wow.
Knight to d4 is kind of releasing the tension.
Yeah.
Not the tension in the position, the tension in your mind.
Yeah.
And the reason it releases the tension is because after knight d4, it's just forcing moves, right? Queen takes f4, forcing thing to calculate. Rook takes d4, forcing thing to calculate. G5, there's nothing to calculate. It's just a tense position that remains for a long time.
Yeah.
So this was definitely a psychological. This is not a chess mistake for Jan. This is a psychological mistake or a mistake in terms of handling pressure, which definitely is very understandable, and we've all been there, especially in tense tournaments, especially when the stakes are high like they are here. Ding.
But as you mentioned before, and I'm going to quote you on that, and that quote is going to be yours. Chess doesn't care about the tournament that you're in. I think it was something along those lines.
Yeah, I don't remember exactly, but it was something.
Chess doesn't care about the level of the tournament or like the tournament that you're in. I'm going to rewind and put that quote on a t-shirt because I really like it.
Well, right. Yeah, it's definitely very relevant for this position because, yeah, the position is just better for white. And Ding played according to the demands of the position. He took on d4. I don't think it's a difficult decision, especially when you're in the mood of I want to win this game.
He played it in a couple of seconds. He played it immediately.
Yeah. It's a very, like, every good player would tell you, okay, white's better here, and you have to sack the exchange. It's not like, maybe not everyone would immediately realize that white is completely winning, which is the case, but everyone would realize that white is better at the very least.
Yeah.
And especially when you want to win a game, sometimes you see chances for yourself in positions where chances don't exist, that kind of optimism. So when you have a position where chances do exist, then you definitely see them. And so Ding took, knight b3, absolutely excellent position for white now. Jan, you have to do something. Like, your pieces are all dead. Yeah. Queen, both rooks are dead. You have to do something. One thing is that c5 comes to mind. And the funny thing about this position is that even if white doesn't do anything, the d and e pawns are going to become too strong.
Yeah.
But specifically here, d6 just wins on the spot. d6, you have to take on e6. Well, I mean, you can also resign, but let's say you take on e6. Rook e6, rook e6. Of course, white has many ways to win, queen d5 and so on, but d7 is very clearly that the pawn is going to, it's probably just going to become a queen, in fact, because I thought it would cost a piece, but then I realized rook to d6 is met by queen a8, king f7, and not some kind of winning the rook, which would also win, but queen to e8 checkmate.
Very nice. Yeah.
So that's even worse for black than than anything else.
Yeah.
Instead, Jan played g5. Basically, he wants to just kind of get the queen to g6 and try to pawn storm on the king side. It will never work because black has no activity, but we got to give it a shot. Knight takes d4, queen to g6. Now Ding made excellent move, not the only move, of course. He has a very good position, but this move really puts the final nail in black's coffin. g4. g4 is a very clear positional idea. White wants to put the knight on f5. The knight would be really beautiful there. And basically, the thing is, black might have some kind of counterplay with h5 and g4 and rook to h7. But with the knight on f5, for example, let's make the moves h5, knight to f5, rook to h7. Black has saved the rook and has h5. You would think some counterplay. White can simply make, for example, king to g2. hg4, hg4, and I dare you to move a single piece for black. The queen on g6 simply has no moves. If it could go to h6, it would love to, but it can't. Yep. If black could double the rooks on the h file, he would love to, but he can't. He cannot move anything.
Yeah, there's nothing to do. I mean, you could try to go king h8, queen g8, but then still you lack squares. You cannot double up on the h file.
Queen g8 doesn't actually free your pieces whatsoever.
Doesn't improve your position at all. Yeah.
So
it's sad. It's a very sad position.
Here you're just waiting for the final denouement, whatever that is. And it will come in some form. It will probably come in the form of white moving the queen, because f3 is actually not really a threat at any moment. The knight on f5 always defends things, followed by c5, and then opening up the position because the knight on f5 it's not just that white has like a domination in closed positions. Once the position opens up, the domination remains based on the pawn on e6 and the knight on f5.
Yeah.
So this is dead lost.
Oof.
So after g4, Jan played en passant, f takes g3.
Mm-hmm.
And now we have the same idea. Ding took on g3, and again he gets the knight on f5. So that was the point of g4. In either case, whether black takes the pawn en passant or not, the knight on f5 is coming.
Yeah.
h5. Jan played that so that after knight f5, he can play rook h7 without losing his rook.
Mm-hmm.
Which, to be honest, if he had not moved the rook to h7, I doubt Ding would have ever taken that rook.
He would have not taken that rook on e7. No way.
But it doesn't really change matters because the rook on h7, you know, it can be there. It can be on g7, for example. The computer says rook to g7, and white doesn't take the rook on g7. So it doesn't actually matter where the rook goes.
Yeah.
Ding played queen to e4. Threat, knight to e7, winning the queen. Jan played king to h8 to remove that threat. Ding played e7. He did not have to rush, but the computer says this is actually the top move, so good choice.
Mm-hmm.
His idea is queen to e6 is coming, and maybe queen to d7, and then maybe d6 at that point. And basically, you're dominated, so I can take my time here.
To get to that promotion square. The rook on e8. Remove the rook from e8 and then promote the pawn.
At some point, that's your plan. But you're very happy with white because even if you might not see the immediate breakthrough, you know that your opponent never can improve the position. Never.
Yes.
You will never, ever free yourself from this knight on f5. Mm-hmm. If black plays g4 here, white simply plays h4. And likewise with h4, g4. Basically, this is like typical. We might see this in king and pawn endings where we have this standoff of pawns. But black would love to create some sort of openness on the king side. White, of course, wants to keep the structure on the king side closed. Mm-hmm. Jan played queen to f7 to avoid queen to e6. Ding played a sharp move. I think he just wanted to calculate this game to victory. The computer likes to play a sadistic way. King to g2, a4, g4. I mean, you don't have to do this. What Ding played is great. d6. cd6 forced, otherwise d7 comes. Knight takes d6. The point is queen takes e7. Simply knight takes e8. White has one apiece, and that's going to be the game because black only has one pawn for it, and it's not even a particularly useful pawn. So Jan played queen to g8. Now Ding took on e8. Queen takes e8. Material is equal at this moment, but the pawn on e7 is too powerful. Queen to e6. In case of something like rook f7, white has queen takes f7.
Ooh.
Jan played king to g7 to defend f6, rook to f1, rook to h6 to defend f6, rook to d1, threatening rook to d8, mm-hmm. f5, trying to attack the queen because you have no other way to stop rook to e8. Mm-hmm. Queen to e5 check, king to f7, queen takes f5. Again, white is operating with an abundance of winning ways. After queen f5, if king e7, rook to e1, among other things, just wins everything. Yes. Rook to f6. Queen to h7, again, abundance of winning paths, so Ding did not have any pressure here. King to e6, queen to g7. Computer also likes rook to e1, for example. At this point, white is actually up material, so it's not even a question of compensation. Queen to g7.
Yeah.
Again, the idea is queen e7, rook e1 wins the queen. Rook to g6, because the threat was rook e1, so you had to get the rook out of the way. Mm-hmm. Queen to f8, and in case of rook g8, I wonder what he would have done. I mean, Jan resigned. Mm-hmm. But after rook to g8, the computer says rook to e1 with basically almost checkmate. But you also have queen takes g8, queen takes g8, rook d8, which also forces resignation because either you lose your queen, your mm-hmm. rook down to endgame, or that pawn promotes. So that was the game.
You know, now the vultures are coming. What about rook to d8 after rook to g8? Just to put all the major pieces on the 8th, right?
Yeah, I mean, you can do what you want. If you want to play rook d8, we don't know what Ding wanted, although I'm sure he would have paused and enjoyed the moment for a bit if rook g8. So instead, Jan resigned after queen to f8, which is what I think most of us would have done at that point.
Yeah.
So brilliant game by Ding. I mean, we can't say it's like perfect, but he kept the tension. He played very ambitiously. Sacked a pawn when it was called for. Very aggressive, put the pressure on Jan. The pressure was too much to handle, and he won the game.
No, I have to say, and yesterday we kind of anticipated this based on how that game went. With the black pieces, Ding had absolutely no problems squashing, let's say, the opening advantage of Jan. That was definitely an improving sign. He also mentioned that he kind of managed to stir the ship in terms of his mental breakdown that he was experiencing in the first couple of games. So definitely a completely different thing. And we've seen that in a lot of tournaments. We've seen that in the candidates in 2020. We've seen that in the candidates in 2022. So he starts slow, but once he picks up the pace, he can definitely string some important victories. Once he gets into that mental headspace, that positive mental headspace, then he's a very dangerous man. And this is exactly what we've seen from him today. And yesterday also we mentioned that we're looking at signs of frustration coming from Jan. And that move, knight to d4, that was a sign of frustration, a sign of tension building up, and it being unbearable for him. So in the last two games, I have to say the match has kind of turned 180.
Yeah, it's looking very good for Ding. I mean, especially this game. I like the opening choice. I like the decision making. I don't really know the time management, but if I saw that, I'd probably like that too. And it's definitely a departure from the sort of time management and poor decision making that plagued Ding's loss in the second game with the white pieces. Looks like a whole different Ding. Very scary level of form that we saw in this game. Also, yesterday he seemed pretty confident. Not much happened. Like there wasn't enough content to say, and that's why we weren't speculating too much about what the last game meant. But definitely, he had a confident draw, and now he had a very confident win. And it's very good that this happened before it was too late, because you mentioned the candidates in 2020, for example. He was actually -3 in that tournament before he made a comeback in the second half.
Yeah.
And -3 is just too late. Like you can make all the comebacks you want. You're just too far behind.
Yeah.
So, I mean, of course, in a match, I guess you could always keep fighting -3 or not, but usually in a match, if it's -3, nobody comes back from that. So he equalized the match before it became too late to come back. And we were saying it was too early to say. 2 games out of 14, bad form or not, it's still early days. And Ding's mood improved yesterday. That was a good sign for him. He definitely came to form with this game. I think, though, it's a little bit like, I don't know if form is the right word, because sometimes a player has a tournament and they seemingly can do no wrong, and we say they're just in great form. But in a match, I expect the pendulum to shift, both psychologically, mentally, and in terms of form. And we rarely see that a player just dominates from start to finish. I can't think of many examples. I can think of Kramnik Kasparov, like from recent examples, where Kramnik basically Kasparov never got in it, and Kramnik won the match with 2 wins, and the rest were draws, and Kasparov never could get into a match. I remember Carlsen and Anand from 2013, where Magnus won with 3 wins, and Vichy seemingly never could get into the match and never believed in his chances to win. But if I'm thinking about other matches, for example, Carlsen and Anand from 2014, at some point Carlsen was leading, but then he lost a game with the black pieces and the Queen's Gambit declined, and then suddenly he blundered like 2 pawns in a better position, and that would have completely turned the match around. And if I'm thinking about even Anand Kramnik from 2008, where Anand was at some point +3, I think. He won 2 games with the black pieces and 1 game with the white pieces. But then Kramnik won a game with the white pieces in Nimzo, and suddenly we were talking about a shift in the match,
A potential
even
comeback.
though Anand did win that match as well. So a lot of World Championship matches are coming to mind, but or even a great example I suddenly remembered, Kramnik Topalov from 2006. 2006?
Mm-hmm.
I think.
I think
where famous toilet game match, right? Where Topalov lost the first 2 games. Then I think he lost the first 2 games. One both kind of crazy. One in a crazy end game from the Catalan. One in a crazy sort of middle game where at some point Topalov was mating in like 2 moves, but missed it. And so Kramnik wins for the first 2 games. Then he wins a later game. He's +3, and then suddenly the whole toilet gate thing starts, and Kramnik defaults a game, forfeits a game, and then at some point Topalov was leading in that match. So okay, that's maybe a strange example because of everything surrounding it. But still, we sometimes see the back and forth. So I don't think that this is a match which will go one way or the other. I think that there will be some back and forth in this match as well.
Very, very cool. Very cool insights. Very cool match, I have to say, we have on our hands. 2 victories in the first 4 games. We haven't seen that in a very long time. Definitely an intriguing match. It's heating up. Tomorrow is a rest day. We'll be back with coverage of round 5 after tomorrow. Until then, you guys have a good night, and we will see you in the next video.